Sound design is arguably one of the most important parts of the editing process, and getting the sound design right will make a huge difference on the viewer's overall experience with your film. In this video, I want to walk you through my sound design editing process, as well as sharing a few tips and tricks that you can use as you approach sound design in your films. So the way that I think about sound design is that it really has three distinct purposes. Purpose number one is to place the viewer in the scene. Purpose number two is to guide the viewer through the story that's happening in that scene. And purpose number three is to immerse the viewer in the experience of what's happening in the scene and in the story that you're telling through that scene. When I think about adding sound design elements into my films, there's three distinct categories of sound design elements that I add into these films. Category number one is what I'm going to call ambience or ambient audio. Now, the best way to think about this is these are just elements that you would hear if you were sitting in but not interacting with the environment in which you were filming. So for example, say you go to the beach and you just kind of sit down on the sand and start listening to the environment that's happening around you. What are you going to hear? You're going to hear some waves, you're going to hear wind, you're probably going to hear some seagulls and birds flying overhead. You might hear some laughter kind of off in the distance as kids are like splashing in the waves. All of those things are the ambient audio that you're hearing as you just sit and kind of observe the scene. So that's sound design category number one, and that's the ambient audio. Category number two is what I'm going to refer to as practical audio, but you might hear this referred to as Foley audio by people in the sound design world. Practical sound design elements are what I would describe as elements that you would hear or you would create if you then got up from observing and started actually interacting with the environment that you were in. So back to the example at the beach, if you then stood up from the sand and you started kind of like walking along the beach, you'd hear the sand kind of crunching beneath your feet. You might be kind of walking along the edge of the water, so you'd hear some of those water splashes. All of those are practical or Foley sound effects that you would add into your scene. And then the third category is what I'm just going to call sound effects. Sound effects are artificial sounds that weren't actually present in the environment in which you were filming, but help draw the viewer's attention to something that is in the environment in which you were filming, or to something that's actually in the edit as you edit. So these are rises and whooshes and hits and glitches and all those kind of sounds that didn't actually exist in the real world, but really help draw the viewer's attention to something that is happening in the real world or that's happening in the edit. So for instance, if you were filming a time lapse out of the beach and a bunch of clouds flew over, you might add like a whoosh that kind of like happens as the clouds fly over. Obviously, clouds don't make that sound as they fly over. That'd be really cool if they did. That's not actually a real sound that happened in the real world, but it absolutely helps kind of accentuate and draw the viewer's attention to the clouds passing overhead. And obviously that has to be a subtle sound, and we'll talk about the mixing component of that later. Another thing you might add to accentuate the edit is something like a riser or a hit that would kind of like build and build and build as your edits are getting quicker, and then drop to like a boom that kind of happens as a specific clip happens. Obviously that didn't happen in the actual environment in which you were filming. You were just filming some clips, but this really helps immerse the viewer in the experience of what's happening and draw their attention to either something happening in the edit or in the scene that they're watching. So if we go back to the purpose of sound design, the three purposes of sound design were to place the viewer in the scene, guide the viewer through the story, and immerse the viewer in the experience. Each one of these categories of sound design elements specifically addresses one of these things. So the ambient audio and the natural world audio helps to place the viewer in the scene by helping them feel like they're actually there by hearing the wind noise and the waves and any of that kind of stuff that's happening in the natural world. The practical or the Foley audio helps guide the viewer through the story by focusing on like footsteps that are happening, human interactions that are happening, specific things that are happening in the scene as a character in the scene interacts with something else. And then sound effects help immerse the viewer in the experience of watching the entire thing by guiding their attention to something that's happening in the scene or something that's happening in the edit, and really just helps them be immersed and involved in the overall edit of the film. So now that we've kind of talked about the purpose of sound design and how the different categories of sound design elements help achieve and accomplish those purposes in the edit, now let's actually dive into an edit, and I can kind of show you how this all plays out practically. All right, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve with a wedding teaser film that I made a couple months ago. And basically, I just want to walk you through this teaser film and kind of my thought process on why I put certain sound design elements where I did, how those sound design elements fit into the grand scheme of those three purposes of sound design that I mentioned earlier, and just kind of show you my thought process on putting all this kind of stuff together. So I just want to show you the very beginning of this film just to kind of give you an idea for it. I'll give you like the first 10, 20 seconds or so, and then we'll dive into the thought process. All right, let's go.
Before we sit down and eat, we did want to say a little thank you to everybody here. We understand how difficult it was to get here. And
so that's enough for now. So I just want to show you just kind of the beginning. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on visually here, a lot of stuff going on auditorially. And so just want to kind of walk you through that entire process. So obviously sound design and all of these kind of auditory elements that I'm adding are going to be happening over top of any music and voiceover narration that I have in the film. And you can see here on track 1, this is my soundtrack. Obviously I've kind of chopped up this song and turned it into the teaser film trailer soundtrack that I wanted it to be. We're not really here to talk about music and all that kind of stuff, but basically you can see I kind of built this soundtrack to fit the vibe of the teaser that I wanted to have. That's actually how I started this entire thing. I started the entire sound design process and even the editing process in general with the soundtrack. So literally started with nothing other than the soundtrack, built the soundtrack, and then matched all the visuals to that. And then on track 2, you can see there's some spoken word that's happening. It's actually track 2 and 3. This is just some spoken audio from the recorder at the reception for this wedding. And that's definitely going to play into how the actual sound design elements happen, because one of the things I really try to do in terms of balancing levels of sound effects and music and narration is I want to make sure that when people are talking, there's not as much kind of busyness happening on the audio front. And so you'll see even like in where I place sound design elements, the majority of those things happen around the vocals and around the spoken audio. And then you'll also see a huge gap here at the end, and I'm going to talk about why that's there as well. But basically we're starting with a full soundtrack and then some narration. I'm actually going to turn all of that off to kind of give you a feel for the sound design. So the first thing I do whenever I kind of approach a sound design edit is I'll sit back and I'll just go to the very beginning of the project and I'll just watch the whole thing through and go, all right, what do I see? So as we're kind of like looking through, obviously we're out of the coast, so I know I'm going to need some waves. I know I'm going to need, seagulls chirping in the distance. I'm going to need some wind in the forest. I'm going to need some campfire elements with some like, crackling noises and all that kind of stuff. So that's really where I start in terms of like designing the sound design for a project like this, is just go like, all right, what's the vibe here? What am I trying to go for? What's the overall feel of this project, and what elements do I need? And then really I just kind of start by stacking. So I'll start stacking with category number 1, which is the ambient sounds. So those are the sounds that just kind of place the viewer in the scene. So we're thinking sounds like, ocean sounds and wind and all of that. And basically we'll start building those sounds on top of each other. So I'm going to turn off a couple of tracks here and just kind of show you how that actually fits. So if you see here, we start with this kind of drone clip of flying over the Oregon coast. And if I just play this here, you'll hear there's the shoreline sound effect that I used, and then a subtle wind effect that kind of runs really through the entire project. And then like this bright wind sound, because when I'm using a drone shot, I really like to have some sort of like wind sound to kind of make it feel like you're up in the air and it's not just like a random shot that I'm tagging onto things. So you'll see that a lot with my drone shots as I add this like bright winds sound at different levels over top of those drone shots. So if I play this right from the beginning, you'll just kind of hear some of those ambient audio sound effects start coming into play. There's the wind noise, the ocean waves crashing, down to the woods, back to the wind, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of how I approach that. And so basically I'll go through and I have this like shoreline sound that I turned this way down in terms of like the actual decibel level, because again, with this shot, I am up above the coast. I'm kind of pulled back in a drone. And so I didn't want this like sound that feels like you're right on the waves. I wanted it to feel like it was super pulled back. And so this sound effect that I used sounds like this, just some like waves and stuff like that. And so I just took that, matched it to the length of the clip, and then just turned the volume of that way down. So basically it would just sit just above the audio, so you would actually hear that over top of the soundtrack that's playing, but so you could kind of feel like you're there, but again, it feels like you're in a drone, so you're pulled back and away from everything. Then on top of that, I have this subtle wind sound, which kind of plays through a lot of stuff. You can hear that here. Just kind of a very subtle like wind blowing. And then on top of that is this bright winds sound, which is a lot more of aggressive sound that I kind of match with all of my drone shots. So see how that kind of like feels like you're up in the air, like you're up in a little bit more of like some crosswinds and stuff are happening. So those three stacked together is what gives like the ambient audio for this first bit. Then you'll see I have a couple other things here. I have some ocean waves crashing. Now this is a much more direct sound that happens because right here we have a shot of a wave crashing. And so I really wanted to have just immediately like waves hitting. And then right before that, you see that there's these seagulls. Well, I still have the shoreline sound, like the kind of pulled back, like listening to the whole ocean roar. I also wanted to have the sound of just literally a wave hitting, boom, and there that is. So I'm going to move this down here so I can keep that deleted, and then turn these two tracks on, and you'll hear kind of how that stacks in on top. So then I just matched the sound of this track here where the actual wave hits. I just found the spot kind of in the track where that hits there, and then matched that to the spot where the wave was actually hitting, kind of getting punched in the face with that wave. Then we're going to stack on top of that a few more just like sound effects. And so I wanted to really kind of start off really strong right away. And so I have this deep hit sound that I really love. I'll play it for you here. It's kind of like a really low kind of hits. So it's just a great way. If you're not listening on headphones, put those on, because it's hard to hear that low bass sound without the headphones on. But that's just kind of a nice way to like punch right off the start. And then I combined that with this whoosh sound. And then you'll see on the visual edit here, I have this kind of glitch thing that happens if I kind of go through frame by frame, where I've keyframed this out. And so I added this like flutter glitch that I have. I'll just kind of show you that sound. That sound there, and I just clipped the very beginning of that part, and matched that to here. So if we turn all that on now we have all those sounds stacked on top of each other, and we have a sound effect intro that sounds like this. So you see basically how all that flows together, how we have all these ambient sounds that are then stacking with more practical sounds, which then have like sound effects stacked on top of that. And that just really like sets the viewer in the scene, so you feel like you're actually there. And then like when specific things like seagulls, like ocean waves, those kind of things actually come up on the screen, then you literally just get hit in the face with that sound effect, and it's like right there. And then there's also actual sound effects that just kind of like help guide the viewer through the scene. And then one of the things that I think is really crucial in sound design is to find a really good kind of marriage between hard cuts between sound effects and soft cuts between sound effects. And what I mean by that is you'll see here, if we look at kind of the main visual timeline here, I have like all of these different kind of scenes that happen throughout the intro here, and you'll have very specific sound effects that match up with each of those. And that's because this is a pretty aggressive portion of the teaser. We're cutting pretty quickly back and forth between a bunch of different clips. And so what I wanted to do auditorily was match the energy of what's happening visually. And then obviously if we turn the soundtrack back on, we have this kind of like arpeggiated violin that's happening. So there's just a lot of movement, a lot of motion, and so it felt right from a sound design perspective to just do hard cuts between all these different sound effects. So as we cut from this shot here, which is like the drone over the fog and stuff, and then that hard cuts straight into just some wind noise and some woods. So we go from this like big, like we're up in the atmosphere, we're moving through wind, and it just cuts straight down to woods, and then that comes right back again. So like right back to a drone shot, we add the bright winds back in, actually two of them stacked on top of each other. We have this sound called Nowhere that I use, which is a sound that's just kind of very airy. I don't know if you can kind of hear that, but very kind of ethereal sound. And then that hard cuts straight to this car interior sound, which is literally just like driving in a car. And then I also stacked that with this car drive-by sound, which is kind of this cool panned shot that you get like this, of a car like passing by. And so even though literally the shot is in the car, it felt appropriate because the shot here is literally the car like moving past this big rock. And so it's kind of like a pan shot to begin with. And so there's all these like hard cuts, all these like sound effects that are just like very, very quickly changing. And I think that just matches the energy of what's happening from the audio perspective. So if we watch it all again, just so you can kind of hear how all those sound effects kind of stack up with each other, here's what it sounds like. You see now one of those glitches come through. There's this like wind brushing sound here as the bride kind of walks through the forest here and like touches the ferns. So there's just a bunch of different kind of stacked effects that happen over and over and over again. And then again here we have this like whoosh that happens as I do this time lapse thing through the trees here. This is a pretty like aggressive, strong sound that just again back to like the sound effect idea, and the purpose of sound effects is just to kind of accentuate things. So these are like artificial sounds that are happening. Obviously this didn't actually happen when I shot this, but it's just helping kind of lead the viewer through the experience of watching this little kind of time-lapse sequence happen. And then we dip right back out to another drone shot. So one thing you'll notice is all of a sudden these sound effects kind of start dying out. We just have like this bright winds sound, the subtle wind, the shoreline sound kind of cuts in back and forth. There's one more like ocean waves crashing, but really the sound effects for this kind of middle portion just really die out. And the reason for that is because this track exists. So this track is the groom right here talking at the reception. And I didn't want to have a ton of additional sound effects layered over top of his voice because, number one, that's just too many things to try to mix in, and two, we just didn't really need it. So I threw some just wind noise on and a little bit of like ocean waves as we kind of cut to scenes like this where the ocean waves are in the background, and over here where this is actually on the shore, so the waves are down in the background there, and obviously this shot here of the waves kind of rolling up on the shore. But other than that, the sound effect side of things is pretty low because it's a good amount of soundtrack audio happening, and the groom is talking and thanking people in this teaser for being there and taking the drive out, and I didn't want to take away from what he was saying by stacking a bunch of sound effects in. So if we turn that back on, you'll kind of hear how that sounds as he starts talking. Those sound effects kind of like slowly die out, but it doesn't really lose anything from the scene because he's kind of replacing that with his voice.
Everybody here, we understand how difficult it was to get here, and we just can't even say how thankful we are for everyone here. Friends, family, you guys kind of made the people that we are.
Another thing I'm doing here too, even with the editing, is I'm including shots like this here of like the details that don't need any sound effects. There's nothing really here, like even the shot here, the bride like laughing through the window, there's nothing here that needs any sound effect audio other than like the waves crashing, that kind of stuff. So those sounds are there if we just solo the sound effects that are happening. All you're hearing here is just wind and the ocean. And so I'm kind of intentionally matching my clips here too, just to fit the vibe of this teaser, where all we need is just some sounds of the shoreline, some sounds of the wind, and we don't really need anything else to compete with what he's saying. So then if we jump ahead again, you see a bunch of these sound effects start happening again, and that's because we cut to this scene where there's a fire. So the couple actually did this rehearsal dinner night right on the Oregon coast, and then they went down to the beach with their friends and family and made s'mores and had a big campfire and just spent a bunch of time on the beach. And the bride actually mentioned this. She has a whole segment where she talks about the surreal feeling that she had down at the campfire and how special that was. And so I really wanted to include that in the teaser film. And it's really kind of cool because the groom finishes talking right here. He finishes talking right as the soundtrack dies off, and then because the soundtrack dies off, now all of a sudden we have the shoreline sounds come back in, we have the wind sounds come back in here, we have this campfire, bonfire sounds come back in, we have some additional like clips. This is a little bit like a closer shot of a campfire sound, like really close to the flames and stuff. You'll hear the crackles, but it's kind of cool because you can hear the difference between we're prioritizing the soundtrack and we're prioritizing the groom's vocal that's happening, and then as soon as those two things die down, the campfire and all those additional sounds come right back in, and it just really kind of leads this beautiful time for her to talk about a little bit more like an emotive experience that she was having down at the campfire. So listen to how this like plays out.
Thank you guys, love you.
Drop.
I had like a little surreal moment at the bonfire on Friday. We were all like sitting around. It was like getting pretty late, and everyone's still like just hanging out with us, like looking at the stars, exploring. I was like, this is like.
So this is literally all these different layers that are kind of coming together and feeding off of each other. And if I can give one tip from like an audio mixing perspective, it's just don't try to stack too many things on top of each other, because you're just going to start competing sonically for all these sound effects. And so as you see, like the soundtrack starts kind of building up, the groom starts talking, sound effects start dying off, and then those things kind of start dipping down, and there's more of like an emotive conversation, sound effects and all that kind of stuff starts lifting back up again. And then what you'll see is here, this kind of goes, there's a couple more hits that happen here, and then literally it just dies off. And that's because the soundtrack gets huge. There's just tons of stuff that's happening on the soundtrack side of things. You can see the waveform here of the soundtrack just gets huge, and didn't really need anything other than this one practical sound because we had these big waves kind of crashing. And so I included one more shot of like the ocean waves crashing, that like close up sound of the waves. But other than that, the soundtrack just kind of takes everything. So there's one big hit here. This is like a whoosh hit. So it goes whoosh, and then like drops, those kind of tie in together. So you'll kind of see how this kind of fits together here. And then basically there's enough audio that we don't really need to worry about it. There's that sound of the waves. And then nothing. And then we're literally just straight down to the soundtrack itself, and that leads you all the way through to the very, very end, where there's one more kind of big hit that happens. Basically, there's two time lapses that kind of stack on top of each other here. And so I use this sound called Outer Limits, which is kind of like deep rumbling kind of ambient sound, and this Night Winds sound, which is kind of like that ambient, like a little bit more textured wind. And so those both hit as those two time lapses of the stars happen. You can just kind of hear that low ambient rumble with like the wind noise and stuff. And that's the entire teaser film. One little tip that I do want to give you here, just because it's really, really practical and helps a ton in terms of placing audio in the scene, is to use something called a low pass filter on your sound effects. So I'm just going to demo this here on the sound of the ocean waves crashing. So where's that one specific sound right here? So this is just the sound on its own, which is a great sound. Obviously, that's just kind of how it was out of the microphone. But if you go into your equalizer, and you can do this on any program, basically, if you go into your EQ, I'm going to turn off these other bands and just turn the very, very top band on, and just kind of bring this down to like the 4K mark here, or even you can bring it down to like the 1K mark. But just basically to roll off the top and just to let only the low sounds pass through, which is what a low pass means. You're only letting the low sounds pass through. And what this does is basically just kind of tames down the high sounds that are happening and makes it feel like this whole thing is happening at a different distance to you. So we can kind of roll this back as far as we want to, just to really kind of tame down this sound. That's a little bit too much, I think. If we bring it back to like maybe that 4K mark, that just feels like it's a little bit further removed in space. Again, I didn't use it here because I'm actually trying to punch over top of a really aggressive soundtrack. That's why I didn't use that. But if you're trying to find a way to fit your sound effect into a specific scene and it just feels like it's too close or it's too aggressive, you just want to tame that back a little bit, throwing a low pass filter on top of that is a really, really great way to set things back in space so that you're not competing sonically with everything else that's happening. It also just kind of helps step the viewer back in space and feel like you're a little bit farther away. I use this all the time on sound effects just to kind of tame them down and to kind of feel like you're stepping back a little bit from the scene. So that's kind of my approach to sound design and sound effects in general, but I do want to talk about where I actually get sound effects from, and that is from Artlist. Now, Artlist is not sponsoring this video. They're not paying me to make this video or anything, but Artlist is definitely my favorite place to source and get sound effects for my films. And it was actually interesting because when I was going through the first pass of this film and I realized I needed campfire sounds and sounds of like, you know, a fire crackling out of the beach, I didn't have any sounds like that. And so I immediately went to Artlist and searched for campfire sounds, and literally they had a bunch of different sounds that popped up, and I downloaded a few of these and integrated those right into the film. So while I don't pull every single sound effect from Artlist catalog just because I have a library of sound effects that I have gathered over the years, Artlist is 100% the place that I go to source any sound effects that I need to get. It usually takes me 30 seconds to jump on Artlist, find the sound effect that I'm looking for, download it, and integrate it into my project, and it's super, super easy. Now, like I said, Artlist is not sponsoring this video, but they were kind enough to give me an affiliate link. So if you decide you want to check out Artlist and you get one of their annual subscriptions using the link in my description, that'll give me a little bit of kickback and you'll get 2 months for free. So win-win if you're interested in checking that out. But hopefully this video helped tune you in just to the enormous power of sound design and a few extra things you can do with it. My way is definitely not the best way or the only way, but this is kind of how I handle things in my editing. If you have any questions or if you enjoyed the video, let me know down in the comments and I will see you in the next one. Peace.